Thank you for inviting me to speak on sweetness. It's actually a topic I never looked at before. And so in any of my different tenures in academia, at the National Academy of Sciences or at the FDA, but it's been very interesting to dig into and look at what are different regulatory agencies and policy groups saying about sweetness. And so I've been asked to talk about that. So unlike Nadia's presentation that has a lot of figures, I'm just going to show you a lot of text that I have found trying to understand what different groups are saying about sweetness or sweetened foods. And then if there are references to support that particular statement, I will provide it to you. If you don't see it, then that means they've made a statement without a reference. But I was hoping to provide as much of that to the experts that will see the actual reference, and you probably would be familiar with that particular reference that was being used. So I thought what I would do quickly is to just talk about at FDA, the regulatory part and how they are approved as sweeteners, sugar substitutes as ingredients, whether they're non-nutritive or nutritive sweeteners, because in terms of the history of all this that we're talking about, if these weren't approved to be added as ingredients, then that's what we're talking about, are ingredients, then we may not be having this conversation. So in the regulations, there are technical effects for approving different ingredients, whether it's through a food additive petition or a GRAS notification, generally recognized as safe. And so 3 of the 20-something technical effects is as a non-nutritive sweetener, providing a sweetening capacity, which is relevant to a number of the high-intensity sweeteners that I'll show you in a table in a few minutes. Nutritive sweeteners, and there's sweetening capacity. And as enhancers, there's also a third category called flavor enhancers that are ingredients that are added to supplement, enhance, or modify the original taste or aroma of the food, such as unmasking the sweetness of a food. So in terms of FDA, and when they're looking at these ingredients, it's all about safety. Are they safe? Are they safe in terms of the estimated intake, or which they call the estimated daily intake, and in ensuring that it does not exceed the acceptable daily intake that's being determined. The ADI is the amount of substance that's considered safe to consume each day over the course of a person's lifetime. So this involves conducting exposure analyses, understanding, well, if this ingredient is added to these different foods, what's going to be the total consumption of that ingredient? And then how does that compare to a level that's been determined to be safe? And so this is, let me go back. And this is the ADIs all determined using various type of studies, toxicity, genotoxicity, metabolism, pharmacokinetics, and then conducting a risk assessment. So then it really is about determining the sweetness and intensity as an ingredient. And when these companies submit either a food additive petition or a GRAS notification, the goal or a major objective at FDA is not to understand, well, what are the methods that were used to talk about sweetness? These are in ingredients, that's already known. These petitions and notifications may talk about the sweetness or intensity of the ingredient, providing references, but that's not a major review part at the FDA in terms of determining if they're safe or not. Also, the concept, as was just previously discussed by Nadia, that the concept of ingredients providing a sweet flavor have been considered since the early 1990s when reviewing saccharin. But again, sweetness has not been an issue in terms of determining whether an ingredient can be added to a food or not. has not been an issue at the FDA in terms of claims. And then I just recently checked, it's not on here, has not been an issue in terms of standards of identity for foods. So, like the FDA, there's other regulatory organizations that really follow the same concept of being safe for its particular intended use. And that's the JECFA, or the Joint FAO-WHO Expert Committee on Food Additives, Health Canada, FSANZ, which is the Food Standards Australia, New Zealand, and EFSA, European Food Safety Authority. And actually, this nice table comes from the ILSI website, ILSI North America website, that shows you how FDA and these other regulatory agencies have determined the acceptable daily intake for these different high-intensity sweeteners. So if you look at FDA, as we talked about previously, cyclamate is not on there. You can see the NA, it's not available. But in general, there's a commonality across these three particular regulatory agencies and what the acceptable intake is. So now what I'm going to do is talk about what different organizations, public health associations, governments have said about sweetness, or if they have not talked about sweetness at all. So starting in the United States, let's talk about the dietary guidelines for Americans, the most recent one. When I look through this policy report, the only thing you really see is that it talks about the benefits of added sugars providing sweetness, and that it can improve the palatability of foods. There was no discussion about the impact of sweetness on food preferences. When you get to the American Academy of Pediatrics, there's a report that came out on snacks, sweetened beverages, added sugars, and school council on school health from the Committee on Nutrition. This was published in 2016. They talk about how sweetness can offer an effective tool to promote the consumption of nutrient-dense foods and beverages. It's a positive thing, referencing Adam Dranowski. And then they go on to say that, the non-nutritive sweeteners are used as a tool to replace added sugars and help lower caloric intake. Plus, as FDA has determined, they are safe. Again, no discussion on the impact of sweetness on taste preferences. When you get to the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics on a report regarding use of nutritive and non-nutritive sweeteners, this was published in 2012, and talking specifically about the non-nutritive sweeteners. It's discussed in this article about how they can help consumers limit carbohydrate and energy intake and manage blood glucose levels and body weight. But they also go on to say consumers who want a sweet taste without energy can choose from 7 FDA-approved non-nutritive sweeteners. Finally, another point I wanted to bring up is when it talks about sweet taste, what they note is that differences in preference for sweet taste are most likely due to interactions between genetics and environmental exposure, referencing Reed et al. In 2006. With respect to non-nutritive sweeteners, again, there was a combined scientific statement from the American Heart Association and the American Diabetes Association in 2012 on non-nutritive sweeteners. And again, talking about how there can be genetic differences that can impact preferences for both caloric sweeteners and non-nutritive sweeteners. And preference for sweet taste in humans is more complex and involves many central receptor mechanisms, including but not limited to dopamine signaling. But at the end, they do say at the bottom there that the presence of caloric sweeteners may also enhance taste acceptance. Now, moving north to Canada, recently this year, the Canadian guidelines came out, dietary guidelines, And there's a section in there about sugar substitutes. This is the subtitle. Sugar substitutes do not need to be consumed to reduce the intake of free sugars. And the basis that they primarily argue is that there's no well-established health benefits associated with the intake of sweeteners. And so that kind of struck me as interesting because usually ingredients are about being safe, not providing health benefits. When you go to their website to look more about the consumer, for the consumer discussion about their new food guide, and I've provided the website for this, there's a little section, consumer education section about sugar substitutes are not needed for healthy eating, talking about eating food sweetened with sugar substitutes can make healthy eating more difficult. So this is kind of the opposite of a prior report that I mentioned, because foods and drinks with sugar substitutes may replace healthier foods and still taste sweet. Regularly eating foods that taste sweet can lead to a preference for sweet foods. I could not find a reference for that. And then another subtitle for that is how to decrease your intake of sugars without sugar substitutes. And so they give several guidance on doing that, but as you see in the second bullet, they talk about foods consumed at an early age, referring to these sugar substitutes, can influence their taste preferences and lifelong eating habits. And so they encourage sweetening foods with naturally by using fruits. So this was all on the Canadian website that kind of is a companion website to the new guidelines. Now moving east to England, there are a number of documents that have come out from Public Health England. But what's nice about some of these is now they're actually reviewing the evidence. They've pulled it all together and they make these conclusions. Public Health England actually asked questions and then they did the science review and then came up with a summary of what they found. So the first question they ask is, to what extent does variation in preferred levels of sweetness predict intakes of sweetened food drinks? And from the review, they said it seems that consuming highly sweet foods early in childhood may influence preference for and consumption of sweet foods and drinks later in childhood. The evidence comes from 2 RCTs suggesting that consumption of sweet drinks containing non-caloric sweeteners compared to consuming water may satisfy a desire for sweetness in the short term. And I've provided the references, Piernis and Peters. Those are the 2 that were used for that. And I italicized short term because these were pretty short term studies, or they were, several months. One of them was several months, but they evaluated the desire for sweetness at different time points. And while they saw a dip in desire with the water group, but then it didn't hold, and so there was not any difference at the end of that study, or it may have even gone the other way. Another question they asked, which is kind of a harsh question, is sweetness addictive? And basically they determined that the evidence was limited for this, and that it was probably better to use the word like craving and liking when referring to sweetness rather than addiction. So there they determined the evidence to be limited. So from all this, this report, again called Sugar Reduction, the Evidence for Action, the Public Health England noted that they found only one paper in relation to adaptation of palates to sugar. This is by Yang in 2010. When you look at it, it's a review article. And so the one paper in this review article that seems to address this, which I think they're addressing, I'm not sure, is a paper authored by Liem, L-I-E-M, in 2004. Okay, in addition, this is what was stated in this Sugar Reduction Evidence for Action 2015 paper, and that it was, when undertaking reformulation, reductions in sugar could be achieved with or without sugar replacements, and the advantage being that it allows the palates to adapt to a less sweet taste. So, so the recommendations and the science kind of, in my viewpoint, kind of don't necessarily agree, but as I think you used the term, Johanna, is that there's often one is being precautionary. It's just how often can you be precautionary for different ingredients or nutrients. Now, this is a separate Public Health England paper article called Sugar Reduction, Achieving the 20%, published in 2017. And in it, it's a technical report outlining progress to date, guidelines for industry, and looking at 2015 baseline levels and key foods and the next steps. And so in this report, they note that they endorse EFSA's scientific opinion on low-calorie, non-caloric sweeteners as being safe and acceptable alternative to using sugar. And then they go on to say Public Health England sees advantages in businesses not adding sweeteners to their products, again, allowing for people's palates to gradually adjust to less sugary foods. Now, in France, the French Agency for Food, Environmental, and Occupational Health and Safety, they also conducted a review of the scientific evidence on intense sweeteners, published in 2015. And again, I'm just providing the general summary of what they determined. They split it up between adults and in children, but both of them are fairly similar in saying that it's not possible to determine effect of regular intense sweetener consumption on sweet habituation or increased cravings. So that basically was determined for both groups. And then also in Europe, there's a paper that came out, a position paper by the ESPGHAN, the European Society for Pediatric Gastroenterology, Hepatology, and Nutrition Committee on Nutrition, about sugar in infants, children, and adolescents. And in this position paper, they state that with respect to sweet taste and preference for sweet foods, the preference for sweet taste is innate, has a strong genetic component. You hear that a lot, genetics, so that could be a challenge, and decreases with age. Hadn't seen that before. It may be modified or reinforced by pre- and postnatal exposures. Preference for sweet taste is driven by an interplay of many factors that involve feeding behavior, food choices, and taste. And then they go on to say that based on their evaluation of the observational studies that show sugar-sweetened beverage intake during infancy and early childhood is associated with sugar-sweetened beverage intake in childhood and adolescence, these being observational studies, but that this has not been demonstrated causally in randomized clinical trials. Also, they stated in this position paper that observational studies show inconclusive results in association between feeding experience during fetal development and early infancy and later in taste preferences. So I've provided a couple of the references. Well, these are the three that they cited to support this statement in their position paper. And then they go on to say exposure to palatable foods high in fat and sugars before birth via maternal intake or in early pregnancy may lead to overall increase in food intake and increased preferences for palatable foods after weaning. Now, going to the European Union as a whole, they came out with a framework in 2011 for national initiatives on selected nutrients. And what this was about was to set out a framework for cooperation between the EU member states who want to work on reformulation issues, specifically addressing salt, saturated fat, and added sugars. And when it came to specifically added sugars, It was noted that overall it is preferred that the reduction of added sugars also leads to a reduction of the sweet taste, and in order to allow for adaptations of taste to lower levels of added sugars. Now, the European Union was also involved in an EFSA project where they put out a draft protocol for public comment, and this was to eventually come up with a scientific opinion on dietary sugars. So it was collecting information about dietary sugars, but also eventually coming up with a tolerable upper intake level for dietary sugars. And I wasn't able to find this document, and so I don't know if the EU was responding to something specifically that was in that document, but the EU did say sweet taste and the development of taste and food preferences in infants and children are not endpoints for the assessment. And by that, they mean the assessment for determining a tolerable upper intake level. So as a result, in the 2018 protocol for scientific opinion, it does not include sweetness or sweet taste as an adverse endpoint for sugars and setting an upper level for that. Now, going on to the World Health Organization, I couldn't find a global document that talked about sweetness and anything related to it. I did find one that's specific to the Eastern Mediterranean region that talks about the adaptive process and limiting sweetness and how it can trigger taste buds, which specifically respond to sugar, lead to neurochemical changes and a sense of reward. No references, so I wasn't able to provide those for you. And that it can lead to a state of dependency, can become habituated with lower sweet tastes, and allows for the taste reward system to readjust. The state of dependency, that reference is by Wang et al. In a book called In Food and Addiction, published in 2012. Now, moving on from WHO as a whole to Codex, which is under WHO. This has been around a while. Now we're trying to set standards for foods. What should be in a particular food? That's what is meant by standards here if you're constructing one. First of all, just to tell you, Codex develops standards and guidelines that can be used by any country. Usually they're used by countries that don't have the infrastructure, like say the US or Canada has a particular regulatory agency or anything close to it to rely on. And these are also voluntary. They're not regulations, they're just guidelines and standards that can be used if a country chooses to. So actually I was the US delegate when the ready-to-use therapeutic foods came about, RUTFs, and this is about producing foods for individuals with severe acute malnutrition, in obviously in developing countries, and so there was a real push by the European Union in 2018 to add this statement: any carbohydrate added for sweetness should be used sparingly, and then when this went to the Codex Commission, which is, so CCNFSDU is a committee on nutrition for foods and special dietary uses. There's like 20 different committees under Codex. The commission eventually approves all these documents. So it has to be approved by the commission to become finalized. And so at the commission meeting this past July, views from other members and observers expressed that sweetness would be difficult to objectively measure, and the commission agreed to delete the phrase that the European Union wanted: free sugars added for sweetness should be used sparingly. And so checking the 2019 draft and this past November discussion from the meeting report that was just held several weeks ago, that phrase was eliminated. It's not there, and there wasn't any further discussion about sweetness for this particular standard. Now, that's a little different for the follow-up formula standard, which is another standard that CCNFSDU has been working on for some time. It's a very slow process. So various drafts of the follow-up formula standard have included various texts about limiting sweetness of follow-up formulas. And just to give you, and it's very difficult to come up with texts that all countries and observers will agree upon. So this just gives you an example of the differences and the type of comments that have been made on this particular agenda item at the Codex meeting, the follow-up formula standard. And so the EU commented that there's concern about sweet tasting follow-up formulas that could lead to the development of a preference for sweeter foods later in life. But the US commented that sweet taste is subjective, has no definition, and is not enforceable. So it can be really difficult and take years, and sometimes there's no progress made on some of these documents. So here's another interesting comment that was made by the International Special Dietary Foods Industry, ISDI, who is mainly comprised of a good chunk of their membership is the infant formula, follow-up formula industry. And they noted that sweet taste is complex, subjective, and non-enforceable. Only methods currently available would require human sensory panels, not appropriate for compliance or enforcement purposes. Sweet taste is highly dependent on various factors such as food matrix, blood sugar level at time of consumption, which is, I thought, interesting, temperature of the food ingested, and it would be very difficult to develop or validate an objective method for measuring sweetness. So at the commission, this discussion came up on this particular standard, the way it did with the RUTF standard in terms of concerns about compliance, being able to measure this, and noted that it would be important to avoid making comparisons on the sweetness, as it's difficult to implement and control due to lack of internationally validated methods, and it would be difficult to objectively measure sweetness. And one delegation said, well, there are two out there, two ISO methods you might want to look at. I've provided the details on these, ISO 3972, 13299, and I provide the website addresses for these as in terms of consideration. So this summer, it looked like, well, the sweetness issue was going away because the commission said, well, it can't be adequately or accurately measured. But for somehow, it continued to have its discussions at the November meeting just last month. And so while the commission said there are methodological issues, these two texts are in that standard right now. For products based on non-milk protein, carbohydrate sources that have no contribution to sweet taste should be preferred, and no case be sweeter than lactose, and ingredients shall not be added with the purpose of imparting or enhancing a sweet taste for young children. Now, this has not been approved by the commission, and in this meeting report, which was also, I think, in your slide, Johanna, a little bit about what they said about the methods. There is another committee, CC-MAS, that has analytical experts on it. And so they asked for CC-MAS to look into the availability of methods for measuring sweetness, noting that standards of development organizations are discussing ways to measure sweetness and to determine whether there are internationally validated methods to measure sweetness in these products. The secretariat who runs the meetings for this particular committee stated that questions on methods generally did not prevent the progress of a standard nor its adoption. So even though it was an issue for the RUTF standard, it seems to be moving forward to have this type of text in this particular standard. But again, it's not finalized. So that's why it's important for international observers to provide comments on this if there are issues that you see with the text that's in these documents. So I'll just stop there. I think I'm short of time. This is just kind of a review. What I'm just saying is, as a person who knows nothing about this topic, it looks like the evidence is fairly limited, or it would be if we were doing a pre-market review of this at the FDA for a health claim, in terms of sweetness and preferences later in life. What there does seem to be was in short term. However, it doesn't seem to have an effect on some of the policy statements and standards that are out there. And it may be the date in which they were published, I don't know. And that, the methods, there seems to be concern about them. However, the concern seems to vary. I mean, Codex is the only group that I really saw that was interested in understanding how sweetness should be measured for enforcing their standards. So I'll stop there and answer any questions if I can on this topic.